Good day, folks. Welcome back to Technical Writing, a day where we have content again. You'll notice, if you ever look at the syllabus, that we're almost caught up topic-wise. We spent quite a bit longer on resumes than I had planned, and managed to shave a little bit off here and there. I think we're almost caught up, I think, so might get to cover some additional fun writing concepts. Don't forget your handoff assignment, which is due sometime soon. Right? So today we're looking at tutorials. Tutorials specifically for developers. To be differentiated from a topic we're going to look at later, tutorials for people who are not developers. So I'm going to lead with a question in Discord. I'm going to take a poll here, and that's how many computer science related tutorials would you say you look at in an average year? This is, of course, you being a full-time student. You are trying to learn all about computer science. Presumably you do quite a bit of learning in your free time as well, if you have any. And then, of course, when something isn't quite explained well enough to you in class, most of you probably go to YouTube and find that Indian guy that knows how to do it. Right? So that Indian guy on YouTube, it's almost an amazing cultural phenomenon, but there are a lot of computer science educators in India. A lot of them were early adopters on YouTube, so you type in keywords like how to do such and such in Java, a lot of the time you're going to find a video with like, I don't know, 5,000 views showing you how to do it. It's always an interesting thing to find a helpful one, right? So I think everybody's probably familiar with what I'm talking about, but who knows if you found a helpful one in that category. But you want to be that guy. You want to be helpful to the community. You don't necessarily want to have to do your instructor's job or Java's job for them. So realistically, all of that stuff that you were looking up, that should have been somewhere else in a better format. If you were deep into the YouTube, trying to watch a video of some guy doing it, that's an example of there really not being a good developer accessible tutorial for that topic. And so today we're going to look at what it means to write a tutorial, what tutorials are compared to other kinds of guides, and what you should do if you want to write good tutorials. I would say that of all of the different kinds of documentation, generally I find tutorials the most lacking when I go out into the world. And most of the languages and skills that I've adopted, I've sought out because they had good tutorials. So generally, if I run into a platform and I start learning it and I find that its documentation is trash, I can tolerate it if there are enough decent tutorials out there. If the documentation is trash and there are no tutorials out there, I usually abandon it. If the documentation is good and there are no tutorials out there, sometimes I'll stick with it, but usually I'll abandon it too. So it's really the lack of tutorial content that I think is the biggest determinant in whether or not your language is going to be adopted. And I think that's true of other platforms as well, other different kinds of software and even tools. So things like your text editor or whatever. It really is the likelihood of those things being adopted depends on whether or not you've got good tutorials. So I think most people said D, so 50 to 100 tutorials a year. That's quite a few. Okay, so first of all, I recognize that this is a little bit meta, that this is also a tutorial for developers in the sense that you are all becoming developers, and technically all of your computer science education to date is a tutorial of sorts. The difference between the education you've received and tutorials in general, the biggest difference probably is that you've gotten graded. The other big difference is that you have in-person, up till now, lectures, and even when they're not in person, you have this opportunity to ask questions of your instructor, which is an opportunity you do not usually get in the tutorial. But most people don't take advantage of that opportunity. Most people don't really see their instructor. From my experience, it's only a handful of you that actually ever reach out for any kind of help. So most people are kind of in the same tutorial land that everybody else is in the sense that you're just watching the content. You're not producing any questions in response. So the only additional feedback you get is grading. A tutorial generally doesn't have any grades. It's got no pressure. And of course, we already did that poll, so most people are looking at dozens of tutorials a year as part of their computer science education. And I think that you will maybe look at fewer, but you will still look at many, many tutorials when you are a professional, because you have to continue learning and adopting all the different fancy frameworks that they keep making you adopt. So what does it mean for it to be for developers versus for everybody else? So developers are a special audience in one particular sense, and that's that they care primarily about the tech. So if a developer is looking for your tutorial, and you can probably attest to this as a consumer of tutorials, you want to know how to do the thing. You don't really give a crap about anything else. In fact, it's very irritating when they start talking about something other than the tech. Unless it's extremely relevant, it's immediately quite irritating. Nobody cares how your thing works under the hood. Nobody cares about fun development facts, that it was made in Steve's garage, or that this uses the Ubuntu 16 platform, or anything like that. Nobody cares. They just want to know how to develop as quickly as possible. Developers want to get the ball rolling and develop as soon as they can, because for most of us this is a job. There are instances where you look at tutorials for your hobby, but even in that case, you probably just want to develop. You're not there to read a history book. You're not there to learn all about the language or the platform or the program or whatever. You are there to get developing in that environment as soon as you can. So developers have this focus that other audiences don't. They have a more singular focus than other audiences do. Let's talk about the difference between teaching and guiding. So a tutorial is not a guide, it's not a manual, a reference, an article, an explanation. A tutorial is a learning thing. It is a thing for learning. The goal of a tutorial is to teach or to learn from the reader's perspective. So to teach from yours, to learn from theirs. I like to point out the difference between learning and training. So I try to avoid the words train and trained. Training is kind of a hard one to avoid because that's the standard word for for example, a class or something. You wouldn't say that that's a learning environment. You generally call that a training environment. So when you attend, let's say, a series of courses, you would say that you were trained to do something. But training is an interesting word because generally when we talk about, let's say, a sea lion, right? A sea lion doesn't learn how to juggle a ball on his nose. A sea lion is trained to juggle a ball on his nose. That's true of all animal expressions. So training can have this negative connotation that learning generally does not. So animals can be trained. They can't be taught generally. We generally don't say that a horse learned or a sea lion learned to juggle a ball. We say it was trained to juggle a ball. And so for that reason, I try to avoid the words train or trained when I'm talking about teaching people to do something. So you can try to do that as well. But again, training, that form of the word is very difficult to avoid just because that's the standard in the vocabulary. So the goal of a tutorial is to teach people, not to train them. So to introduce them to a concept, not to teach them rote mechanical steps like juggling. Although you can certainly teach somebody to juggle, you are not teaching them by repetition and throwing fish into their mouths. You are introducing to them a concept so they can learn it intellectually. A tutorial is not supposed to be a replacement for a real learning platform like a class or like your entire education. It would probably be difficult for you to learn everything you've learned squarely from tutorials, but it is a soft replacement for real training in the sense that some people do. Often you don't have access to a full learning opportunity. The tutorial is the, let's say, minimum effort, cheapest option for most of us, and generally speaking, your employer is not going to send you to some training for the new framework they've decided to adopt. You are just going to have to go out and read the tutorials for yourself. So it's kind of the way it is. It's a soft training, and it's often the only training you get. And even though it's not a substitute for full training, well, it's often something that you're going to have to deal with because that's all you get. So let's compare a tutorial to a guide. A guide is built for a single specific purpose. A guide answers one specific question or one specific series of questions. A guide usually assumes that you have all of the experience up to the point where it starts. You can have a guide for total beginners, a setup guide or something, and that's fine. But the guide assumes a level of experience, and then it starts from there, and then it doesn't really address anything that you might have needed before or anything that you might need after. It just addresses exactly what you need within the level of experience, and it only answers questions like how. So how do I set this up? How do I use this kind of variable? How do I do this? How do I do that? Those are the kinds of questions you see in a guide. It's usually in a step form. You have the first, second, and third thing you do, and at the end you figured out how to X. That's a guide. A tutorial is supposed to be a learning experience. You're showing a user, and generally speaking, you're showing somebody who is a beginner, although technically a tutorial can be designed for all levels. So when I say beginner, I mean beginner relative to the content. So you can have the tutorial that you show at the beginning of your software, for example. Let's say you're teaching somebody to use Microsoft Word. There's definitely a tutorial for Microsoft Word for beginners, but then behind the scenes there are so many other features available, so there's still a tutorial at the intermediate level, a tutorial at the advanced level for people who are beginners to that content. So if you've never explored those parts of the application or those parts of the language or whatever, then you're a beginner to those elements. A tutorial is supposed to show somebody who is a beginner to the elements that it's addressing, how to use something in general. So occasionally tutorials, in addition to answering those how questions, so both guides and tutorials answer those how questions, but tutorials sometimes answer those why questions. And the reason you have to answer why questions is because if a person doesn't understand why they're doing something, they likely won't be able to extend that knowledge into general application. So if you don't understand why the keyword static exists, for example, you're not going to be able to write code that uses static variables because you're not going to understand when you're supposed to use it and when you're not supposed to use it. So if you write a guide on how to use static variables, well, you type static, you type it before your public, it ends up like this. Okay, that shows me how. It doesn't tell me why, and it certainly doesn't help me apply that experience in the future. So the tutorial is more future-looking than the guide. You are trying to give people the instructions that they need in order to apply that knowledge. It's not to say it's more useful than a guide. So if, for example, you've simply forgotten the syntax on how to make something static, you would seek out the guide rather than the tutorial because you already know conceptually how to use it. This is often the case, that you know conceptually how to do something. You've just forgotten the exact way, the implementation, the syntax, whatever. So in that case, you seek out the guide on how to do it. So it's not to say that one is better than the other. They just serve different purposes. So let's look at some examples from, let's say, other fields. Let's look at cooking. Okay, so how to peel a potato would be a guide, right? So you just show people how to use a knife or a potato peeler or whatever. Making a potato soup, that would be more like a tutorial because that is an application of multiple different elements of food craftery and potato preparation in order to turn a potato into soup. And that is general knowledge that can be applied to souping other roots. So in either chat, give me a couple examples of other guide versus tutorial examples from other professions. If you feel up to it, I don't know, I'll let you pick the profession. You can go with anything. Blacksmithing. metallurgy, uh, basket weaving. There's some guide versus tutorial examples there from carpentry. So cutting a straight line in wood, probably a guide because it's a simple how do you cut a straight line element, although knowing from experience it's actually harder than it seems, so it's almost tutorial level there. And building your first wooden chair, definitely going to be a tutorial. Skills that you pick up along the way in learning to build your first wooden chair are going to be applicable to carpentry as a whole. So making potato soup teaches you to be a cook. Peeling a potato doesn't really teach you to be a cook. Building a wooden chair teaches you to be a carpenter. Cutting a straight line in wood doesn't really teach you to be a carpenter. You see the difference. The tutorial is helping you to learn that profession. The guide is helping you to learn a very specific task that is part of that profession. Nobody has any cool examples for me. Oh wait, there's an in-class one. Let's see. Accounting. How to use Excel versus making a formatted Excel sheet. Sure. Although how to use Excel is a pretty broad category that could include any number of different tutorials because Excel is probably the most commonly used programming language on earth, if you think about it that way. And many of you are figuring that out as you use Google Sheets for everything, which is essentially just a cloud version of Excel. What's the point of a tutorial? So obviously you are bringing new users into your language, your platform, your software, whatever it is. The tutorial is the first thing that people see. And when you bring in new users, that's good for your platform overall. It's good to bring in new people. If you don't, then your platform is probably going to die eventually. So you want to bring in new users. That means that you want to get a tutorial that is as good as possible so that the first thing that new developers see when they encounter your whatever it is a positive experience and they want to stick with it. The fact that you've gotten people to your tutorial at all is usually a win. It means you've either completed the project or you've published something, or even better, you've successfully marketed it on the internet so that strangers can see it, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. If you've put in all of that effort, you better at least have a good tutorial so that people don't just chuck it in the trash because they consider it to be too complicated. Another use might be getting your existing users to skill up or do it right. And when I say users, I also mean consumers of programming languages, development platforms, whatever it happens to be that you're writing a tutorial for. Even for carpentry or something, you can be instructing the other more junior carpenters whom you are trying to mentor how to do it right, how to do it better, how to cut a better straight line and build a better chair. You're not trying to generate experts. If somebody wants to become an expert, they will seek professional training, they will take a class, they will buy a book, they will probably not just run into a tutorial. But expertise is generated through incremental learning, so at some point you read enough tutorials and actually implement them. If you do a carpentry tutorial every day for a year or so, you will probably become an expert in carpentry, or at least something similar to an expert in carpentry. You could also write tutorials to introduce changes to your platform. In fact, I think you kind of have to. I think anytime you may have a major feature update or UI change, you should write a good tutorial. So for this, I'm going to poke at, let's say, Windows. Windows is a steaming pile of junk when it comes to this. They move features around, they change the UI, they give you literally nothing to indicate that they've done this. You just have to figure it out, and good luck. And then they also reset different UI elements and settings as they do this. Totally unacceptable. Windows 10 is crapware because of this. You contrast that to, let's say, Discord. Every time Discord has a feature update, there is a changelog that pops up, and it shows you exactly what's been changed and how you may use it. It actually always comes with brief tutorials in the changelog on how you use all of the new features. They're not very, fleshed out, but because Discord is such a simple platform, they're usually all you need in order to figure out how to use the new features. So Discord, very good in this case. Yeah, so anytime that you change features, anytime you update the UI, you should have some kind of tutorial for your existing user base to show them how to make that transition to whatever the new system is. So, how do you write a good tutorial? First, let's go back to this concept of Shoshin, which again, I don't know how to pronounce, so that's probably not correct. But that's the way it's spelled in American, so that's the way I'm going to say it, Shoshin. Shoshin is the beginner's mind, the innocent mind, the empty mind. So it's a Zen expression that comes from being a true beginner and understanding what it's like to be a beginner. So obviously once you have developed something, once it is your platform, you no longer remember what it's like to know nothing about it. So you need to go back to that state of remembering what it's like to know nothing about it. That's not easy to do. But remember that when you're new to something, and again, you guys are consumers of tutorials, you remember what it's like to first encounter a tutorial and know nothing. You know that you don't care about small details. That's pretty true universally, right? You're generally only concerned with fundamentals, don't care about small details, don't want to be irritated, you want to learn what you're going to learn as quickly as possible. Communicating that information, though, the more you can go back to that state where you know nothing, the better you can communicate it. So you should practice that state of knowing nothing. The best way to practice is to find people who know nothing and try to explain things to them and see what they get confused about as you try to explain things to them. The better you become at explaining things to people who know nothing, the better of a developer I think you'll be overall. Even if you don't get into any kind of mentorship role at any point in your career, I think it still helps you as a developer to be better at explaining those kinds of concepts. So find somebody who is a complete idiot at something and try to explain something to them and see where your explanation falls short, because I guarantee you there will be certain assumptions that you make based on your experience that they just completely miss because they have not had that experience. Take baby steps. Start with the most idiot-friendly intro possible. So just to be completely blunt about it, be idiot-friendly. Okay, so assume that the person that is reading your tutorial is an absolute moron and knows nothing at all. If it's computer science related, which is what we're talking about here, they know how to power up the computer and get to your page and maybe use their operating system and click the mouse and keyboard. And let's just say besides that, pretty much nothing. All right, because you don't really know what people's skill levels are at. And this can be really hard if you're writing a tutorial for something like how to launch an FTP server on Debian or something. Okay, so that's like 45 steps just to get okay, so I install Debian, I have to configure it, I have to get my user privileges, I have to install this other stuff, and okay, after all these steps I can finally do the thing. Yeah, okay, well, you've got to cover all of that, because the kinds of people who are searching for that information might not necessarily be even at step 1. They might be at step 0. They haven't even installed Debian, so you got to go all the way back to the beginning sometimes, and that's unfortunate. But in that case, break it into steps, and the people who know, let's say up to step 10, they can just skip to step 11. But if you're starting at step 11 and people come in before that, they're just going to leave and they're not going to use your platform. So you want to start as early in the process as possible, even though it's a little bit condescending to start with something so simple. You want to really start as early in the process as possible with the dumbest possible examples. You need to provide an installation and setup guide. This is personally a huge irritant for me, especially in the Linux world. That's why I particularly hate using Linux. You'll go to the page for some software or I don't know, a development platform, language, whatever, and they're just like, hey, all you need to do is sudo apt-get this name and boom, you're good to go. Like that didn't help me. Okay, that's the equivalent of telling me on the Windows platform, just download the executable and click it. Okay, thanks. I mean, really, there's usually something else besides that to it. If that really is all it is, which it is very rarely has been in practice when I've looked into these things, there's always something else to it, then you should still have common hiccups or common setup errors sort of deal, because, man, setup errors are more common than they ought to be. And then what do you do after it's installed? I mean, how do you launch it? All of that stuff. It's just like the basics. It's not difficult to include this information. Not everybody knows it. So how do you install it? Then how do you launch it? All of that stuff. Where does it go? Where does it get saved? That's helpful to know. Some some people had a problem during the documentation assignment with figuring out where their javadoc executable was, because Eclipse just decided when it installed, you know what? I'm not going to point to the javadoc executable. I don't feel like it. So had to have to navigate to their Java installation. Well, where is your Java installation? Like, where did it put it? Well, C, program files, Java, or Open Apache, because they moved to that recently instead of the Oracle JDK. So it's very confusing because you have multiple folders, multiple places it could be. Like, yeah, always have those things. Have those kinds of instructions. Where is it going to go? What do you have to do once it's installed? It's generally not so obvious. Always lead with the equivalent of hello world in whatever it is. The literally easiest thing that you can make. Don't worry even about the right way to do it at this point. That doesn't matter. Just get the user immediate results. Users want to see immediate results. If the tutorial doesn't generate results within, like, let's say 10 minutes minus download time, I think you'll probably lose 90% of your audience at that point. Most people have a pretty good detection for when a tutorial is going to be useful, and that's, did I actually get anything out of it in the first 10 minutes or so? If I didn't, then it's very unlikely I'm going to get anything out of this in the next 10 or the 10 after that. At that point, they will probably seek out something else. So try to get the user immediate results as a demonstration that what you are giving them is not totally worthless. So it's kind of a gesture of good faith at this point. It's also sometimes all the person is looking for. It's all they need. They just needed that initial setup instruction, and beyond that they were able to roll with it. So sometimes people are looking up a tutorial because they just forgot how to use the syntax, they forgot how to set the language up, they forgot how to set the environment up or whatever. All they want to do is look at the how to get started part, and then that's enough of a refresher to get them going the rest of the way. That's pretty common. So for me, every time I open up Android Studio again, for example, it's been probably a year since I last opened it. I know that the next time I open it, everything is going to be moved around, and it's going to be completely different because Google moves everything around every version. As soon as I open it, it's going to tell me that something is broken, and so I'm going to need to fix it. So I'll probably uninstall it and reinstall it and then follow the tutorial because that's just the life of the Android developer. Yeah, I mean, you just expect that, and at that point, you know, the tutorial is what walks me up to the point where I get back to making my Hello World app, and then once I've made my Hello World app, I pretty much know what I'm doing, and I can go from there. But getting to that point seems to change often. So after you've done your Hello World, your most basic thing, that's actually the simplest possible recipe there is, the Hello World recipe. It's the potato soup equivalent, if your potato soup is just potato and water, which is actually not potato soup, it's just like mashed potatoes. But it's the simplest possible thing you can make. So after you've done the simplest possible thing, make a slightly more complicated thing, and then a slightly more complicated thing. Making things is the best way to learn. Tutorials that just explain stuff, just talk about it, blah, 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 are really not helpful. Making stuff is the best way to learn how to do things. So that's why all of my classes are just basically making stuff nonstop and not particularly much of me lecturing, except this one. Irony again. So after you've introduced the basics of your application, software, whatever it happens to be, guide the user through a small sample project. Show them how to do something else, and then go through increasingly complex projects if time permits. So the harder you can go, the better it is for the user. They get to learn more and more about your platform. Let's look at, for example, a carpentry tutorial. So you would start with building a plus sign, then you move on to building a hexagon, then building a chair, then building a table, then building a child's playset, then building a home, then building an apartment, then building a skyscraper. I'm kidding. But, you know, you can move to different elements of difficulty. So you start with the simplest example that people can get rolling in the shortest amount of time that is reasonable, and then you continue on to more and more difficult examples that allow them to improve their skills. tell the user what they're going to end up with. So when they finish your tutorial, or when they finish that section of your tutorial, what are they going to get out of it? Preferably address this in the title. So building a chair, what does that give you? Chair. So, okay, I'm going to learn how to make a chair. Great. Setting up a database in Mongo or something. What are you going to get at the end of that? You're going to get a Mongo database, probably. We would hope. Installing my app on Win 10 should yield you an installed app on Win 10. So it's one way to do it. You could also write a brief description at the top, which is very helpful. I like it when tutorials start with this. They say, we're going to do this. This is going to take about this long, and you're going to have this at the end. Those are always good things to lead with in a tutorial. We're going to do this. It's going to take this long, and you're going to have this at the end. So give a time estimate. Tell people what they're going to get when you're done. That's always very helpful. Use small sections. Split things up into sections that you think an average developer, an average person can handle in about 30 minutes or so. Most developers, 30 minutes, by the way, as a maximum. You can obviously make smaller chunks, but 30 minutes max. Most developers can't commit hours at a time. They have a job on top of whatever learning they're doing. Short chunks are also much more digestible, and oftentimes you only need one piece or one section of the tutorial. So because developers are time limited and because it's just easier to learn in smaller pieces, you always want to chunk your things down as small as possible. That means a series of small projects or small additions to a large project. Then that means that the additions to the large project need to slot in sequentially. And it means that at any given point along the way, you need to make the entire project up to that point available for download, because if somebody has to follow your entire tutorial, steps 1 through 7, just to complete step 8, that's annoying. You want to be able to download up to step 7 and then immediately start at step 8 if that's what you're into. Right. Small projects obviously don't have that problem. You can always just start wherever. But there's also a tendency with small projects to reference back to, we're going to go back to section 3 and pull up what you made. Don't do that. Just include it. Just give them the thing that you're referring to from section 3. If that's a good tutorial, that's what you do. So, explaining why. Unlike a guide, which generally only tells you how, remember, tutorials will sometimes tell you why. Keep your explanation short. You don't want to go into the why in terms of like all the nitty-gritty technical details and implementation stuff. You're just going to say why in simple terms. Remember, you're giving people only the details that they need to understand as a beginner. Another way to think about this is the minimum possible explanation to bring somebody up to understanding. So a good one in learning Java and in teaching Java is, and you probably remember your own experience with this, when you first start Java, you have public static void main string args. Do you explain at that point when the person has first started the meaning of public static void and string brackets args? Well, hopefully not, or they would be incredibly confused. There's just way too much there. It's one of the biggest digs on Java as an introductory language, is it has a lot of baggage that's kind of attached to it right away. And yes, it's not great that you're using this thing and you don't quite understand how all of it works, but a beginner would clearly be overwhelmed by the knowledge of what all of those different keywords mean. So hopefully your instructor, I know it was true if it was me, but hopefully your instructor didn't go into all that crap and just said, hey, this is where the program starts, right there in the first line of that main method. So just don't worry about the rest of that junk for now, and just remember that the program starts executing on that first line there. That's all you need to know as a beginner. You'll get to the rest later. What's public, what's private, what's static, what's an array of strings, why do you take an array of strings? Somebody just asked me this like last week, why is it string args? So a lot of you still don't know. That's fine, you're just not there yet. It's the, in either chat actually. Can anybody answer that with the minimum possible explanation? What is the string args, the array of string? Doesn't have to be named args. Obviously, it can be named whatever. It's just args by convention. So what is the array of strings in the main method? What does that do? What's the point of it? In either chat, give me the minimum possible explanation. If you're writing a tutorial on how to provide arguments to the main method, give me the minimum possible explanation of what string args does. The why is often central to gaining understanding. In that example, it wasn't, because it doesn't matter what string args does. It doesn't matter what public and static and void do in the context of learning Java as a complete beginner. They're not central to the understanding of the main method. So I got an answer of arguments passed by your operating system to run the program. Not really your operating system. See, that's kind of a misleading explanation, although I sort of see where you're going with it. It's confusing to a new user, confusing to somebody with the beginner's mind, because now they think it has some connection to the operating system itself, or that the operating system gets to decide what to do with your application. And now you have this kind of impression that in order to begin programming in Java, you need to first investigate something in your operating system to see what ends up in that args variable. That would be probably a bad impression to give somebody who is learning to use the arguments, to give them the impression that they need to investigate their operating system in some way, because it really doesn't have anything to do with the operating system itself. So I'm going to knock that one. Not a great minimum possible explanation. But it's on the right track, so if somebody can revise it, maybe we'll get to a better minimum possible explanation. What does that string args in the main method do? What's it for? So if the why is not central to gaining understanding, as in that example, then just omit it. And yes, that means that you are omitting important knowledge, but you always have to omit important knowledge, because you can go infinitely deep on even the most trivial stuff, just like I'm doing now. Irony again. But if you go infinitely deep on trivial stuff, then it actually makes it impossible for beginners to learn from what you're teaching them, because as you go deep, they get sidetracked and they forget, and just like I'm doing now. There's so much irony in this slideshow, it's killing me. You don't actually learn how to do the thing that you're actually trying to be taught to do. And the most important thing about tutorials, I think, is that they absolutely have to work. This is so incredibly frustrating to me. Every time I follow a tutorial and it doesn't work, I just go and smash a hole in a wall or something. I mean, it's really enraging when a tutorial doesn't work. Your tutorial has to compile and run, otherwise it is a complete failure. I don't care how successful or well written or beautiful it was. I don't care if it's the nicest and most user-friendly, easy-to-follow tutorial in the world. If it doesn't run at the end, and it's not like a exceptional fluke of the user, then it is a total failure. So just make sure that if a user follows your tutorial, they get a working program or whatever it happens to be at the end. No one wants to take another crack at the minimum possible explanation for what string args does? Come on, you should know by now. You're about to graduate. What if someone asks you at the job interview? They probably wouldn't do that, but what if they do? So they better get a working program when they're done with your tutorial. And it also better work on any reasonable platform that the user might attempt it on. So if it's an application for the system, it better work on Windows and Mac if it supports both of those. If it doesn't, just say it doesn't work on Mac. Be blunt about it, okay? Just be blunt and say, I don't know if this works on Mac or not. I wrote this for Windows. This tutorial is for Windows, okay? If you're following this tutorial and you're not on Windows, it might not work. This tutorial is for Windows, version this, build this, okay? And other software used as this and this, versions this. If you're not using those versions, I make no guarantees it might not work. This is where you get those versions, though. And so when you follow along with this tutorial, make sure you have those versions. Again, otherwise I make no guarantees. Make that explicit. Likewise for like a browser-based thing. Like, this was written for Chrome, build such and such. If you're on a different version of Chrome, I make no guarantees. Be upfront about that. That also means, however, that you need to update your tutorial, because at a certain point when your tutorial is made for Chrome 4 builds ago, no one's able to get Chrome 4 builds ago, or if they are, they probably really shouldn't be using that. So you need to update your tutorial and say, okay, last updated with Chrome such and such. So a tutorial is a living thing that constantly requires updating. You need to keep going through it and making sure that it works with the latest software updates and everything. Otherwise, it just goes back to becoming useless, because as soon as it doesn't work, it's less than useless. It's frustrating. No one's taking a crack at it. You disappoint me. Okay, I think I got one more. Is it the arguments used by the program? Well, that's not helpful. It's called args. Of course it's arguments. You just rephrased the variable name. It's the arguments used by the program. But what is the minimum possible explanation that a beginner would need to understand what string args does or what it's for? The arguments used by the program is a start, but that's probably something they could have inferred. Okay, so visuals help, and again, irony, because this whole slideshow contains 0 visuals, because YouTube is aggressive and finding images takes a long time. So yes, I again realized the irony. Code samples are very helpful. When you are writing code samples for a tutorial, optimize the readability of your code samples. Somebody said, I don't want to argue with the program. That is a good beginner's interpretation of what the previous comment would have meant. Right? If you were a total beginner and somebody told you that string args was the arguments used by the program, it would be a pretty valid semantic parse of that to go, oh, the program's going to argue with me. Well, I don't want to do that. I just agree with whatever it says. That's actually a totally valid thing that a beginner might think, right? So that kind of mindset, again, very important to have. That is absolutely a possibility in that case. Okay, so if you're using code samples, make sure that you optimize for readability, even if it's not necessarily the right way to do it. So even if you are not, let's say again in Java, you're writing a simple introduction on how to make a method. Are you going to instantiate an instance of your class and then call the method that way? For a total beginner, probably shouldn't. You probably should just say, for now, and we'll say later why, we're going to make this method static, and then this is how you call it. Okay, because for a total beginner to programming, the concept of instantiating an instance, that's really complicated. That's already into objects, and objects are way beyond what a total beginner should be able to grasp. Whereas a static method is not too complicated by comparison. So yeah, you would optimize the readability there and optimize the simplicity, even if making a static reference is not the best way to do it. So best practices are still being followed. You still want to have good variable names, good formats. You still want to be doing everything as well as you can, just not in the best possible implementation, because you are still optimizing primarily for readability and understandability. You want to do as best as you can, but without sacrificing the readability of it. And one of the things that really infuriates me is when somebody uses code samples in their tutorial, but they cannot be pasted directly into the IDE. They have some kind of formatting problems when they're pasted into the most common IDE of the language. So for Java, you have pretty much Eclipse and IntelliJ, or NetBeans, or whatever you want to call it. So your code better paste into both of those if you're going to be providing sample Java. This is true of most tutorials, but every once in a while I'll paste something into Eclipse and it'll have extra leading spaces in front of it for no reason. that's really annoying. Especially if I'm pasting it into the rest of my code that doesn't have extra leading spaces. Now I gotta work out all these spaces. It's kind of infuriating. So make sure that it pastes correctly into the common IDE of people's choosings. You can make flow diagrams and different things to illustrate how the program or whatever it is that you're documenting moves data around. Do that when it's appropriate. It's usually not, again, required for the beginner. It's not context that they need to have. So this is something you want to avoid unless you feel like it's absolutely necessary. Likewise for action shots, like showing the program in action. Yeah, they're useful if you're teaching somebody how to use an application. If you're teaching somebody to use something like Excel, your tutorial is probably going to be a series of action shots. Click here, do this, do that. That's fine, but if you're teaching somebody how to write software, you probably aren't going to have too many action shots. You might have one or two of what it looks like when it's running, but there's really not a lot of point in action shots when you're teaching people to learn software. So, use sparingly. Don't just generate a whole tutorial of like, this is the first picture of the program, this is the second picture of the program, and just do step by step until you end up with something. That's probably not going to get you there. But code samples, definitely very useful. And other kinds of diagrams when they are necessary to the context. Irritating the user with animation. Tutorials are best followed at the learner's own pace. And this is especially true in software where you have a variety of different skill levels. You've probably run into tutorials that were way above your skill level and repeatedly rewind them, and that is a big pain. So typically tutorials are completed as well in short chunks. If you're completing a tutorial in short chunks, that means that if it's a video or an animation, you somehow need to find your place the next time you go to it. That can be annoying. Even if it saves your place, it can still be annoying. Video and animation is just usually a poor choice for many different reasons, but rewinding, finding your place are probably the main ones. Speech is pretty low bandwidth compared to reading. Most people can read much faster than they can speak, which means they can read much faster than they can listen. And some people do this hack where they increase the speed of the video to 2x or whatever, but then the person who is doing the video is also typing at double speed, which you probably can't keep up with, and all of the other stuff on the screen is moving at double speed, which you probably can't keep up with. So it's sort of a bad choice either way at that point. Text is probably the easiest in this situation because video, again, not really the best learning medium. And once again, irony, right? But of course I couldn't just give you guys a slideshow text and expect you to read it. That would just be a ripoff. So you get the video, even though it's the low bandwidth mechanism of doing it. It's the low bandwidth, but it's also the sincerest. And sometimes you do want a video tutorial just because of that. You want to get some sincerity out of it. Short clips, though, can still be really useful to demonstrate concepts, especially if you're doing something in real time, and pretty much all the applications you guys are working on have some sort of real-time component, so a little action clip of it might be very useful. Just consider that if you need to show videos or animate things, those are concepts that, again, might be out of the scope of what a beginner needs to know. Those are things that might be more appropriate to a more detailed and nuanced discussion. Those are really probably outside scope usually. So don't rely on video and animation media as your primary learning tool. They are probably not the optimal tools for the job, even though I think a lot of people lean towards video because they're so used to it as a medium. You will generally learn faster by reading than watching. Even if you're the kind of person who learns very quickly from watching, just because watching takes so much longer than it does to read. Now, if you're an exceptionally slow reader, I would say that programming is hard for you in general because it's a lot of code to read. But if you're an exceptionally slow reader, I don't think it's going to make it much faster for you to watch stuff getting typed very slowly rather than to read it at your own pace. So if you're an exceptionally slow reader, video might be even worse for you because what's on the screen will be on the screen, assuming that it's designed for an average reader. The time that it's on the screen will be designed for an average reader. So if you're a slow reader, that just ends up being even worse for you, right? So move at your own pace. Try not to use video too much. Your tutorial can live in the code's documentation. Good code documentation will have tutorial segments to it. So there are your code examples. Code examples are like guides on how to use a particular thing. So we've seen a lot of those in the different code docs we looked at. You'll have the doc explaining how it works, the doc explaining all the variables, and then there will be a little example on how to use it. That example is basically a guide. It doesn't really teach you much, but it shows you how to use it, and that's usually enough in that situation. But some languages go a step beyond, and they offer a tutorial as well inside their documentation. So if you look at Java's Swing library, you'll see that there's these longer and more discussed sections for all of the different components and layouts and everything. So they have a big, like a page or two on how to use a button with a couple of different code samples. They have a page or two on how to use the JLabel with a couple samples. So they have all these different things so that you can learn how to use those different components. So that's great for Java that it has those tutorials. Now, they are pretty crappy tutorials in the sense that they are very complex, and they definitely don't provide you the minimum. They provide you way more information than you need most of the time, while at the same time omitting a lot of the stuff you would need. They also don't give you a minimum working example because you need extra stuff usually for it to compile, which is quite irritating. But they are decent in the sense that they exist. Most programming languages give you nothing for pretty much every library that they have. A counterexample we'll look at in the last few minutes here is Unity. Unity offers full tutorials on all kinds of stuff on their platform. They are extremely open to the offering of tutorials because Unity as a platform is pretty complicated, 3D art and all the other stuff that goes with it, and also because they sell not just to enterprise but also to individuals and small companies, and so they kind of need that adoption. And Unity is very much a bootstrap platform that gained popularity because of its good documentation primarily. So Unreal still dominates the enterprise market because the enterprise market doesn't care so much about good tutorials and documentation. They have their own internal learning, Unreal and other engines like CryEngine and such, but Unity dominates the indie market because it has the most robust tutorial and documentation. And it dominates the indie market to such an extent that it has actually started cutting into Unreal's pie a little bit and cutting into the pie of other big league game engines, and even studios like AAA studios are transitioning some of their games to Unity. This is a network effect that you get when you offer good tutorials. You get a bunch of people who learn how to use your thing, your software. And then eventually those people go off to other workplaces and they go, well, why don't we just use this software? I already know how to use it. This is the same reason that environments like AutoCAD and MathCAD will offer a free trial to students. So while you are in school, you get it for free because they want you to learn how to use it, so that when you become an employee somewhere, you say, well, this is what I was trained in. Can we buy a copy of that? And your employer goes, oh, yeah, only $10,000 for the AutoCAD license. Let's sign you up. It's usually not how it happens, but it is sometimes how it happens. And for the same reason here, if you offer good tutorials, then people will learn how to use your thing. And as they learn how to use your thing, they will go to their place of work and say, can we use this thing? Because I already know how to use it. And for the employer, that's also a win because now you are able to start being productive much faster. So again, tutorials, a very helpful thing. Where else do tutorials live if they don't live on the website of the thing that actually made it, or the thing that owns it? So there's blog aggregators like Medium, so you'll often find good computer science type tutorials on different blog aggregators like that. For some reason I'm blanking on the names of others, but there are so many different blog spam websites out there It's not like I'm endorsing them. I'm not saying Medium's a good place to learn. I'm just saying a lot of tutorials end up there. There's good ones, there's bad ones. Pretty much anybody can post there, but it is somewhat difficult to make an account and get started and actually get decent exposure. You can always make your own website or your own website for your project. A lot of people host their tutorial on their GitHub or something. In that case, you do need to have a little bit of web development experience probably to format it, but it's not necessarily difficult, and that's where many tutorials live, on the GitHub page of their project, basically, or on the personal page of the project developer. You got your wiki websites. Wikis allow public editing, so that can be a problem. Not all wikis allow public editing, so sometimes they avoid that. Sometimes it's hard to find wiki tutorials because they're buried beneath the rest of the wiki. They don't come up well in search engines, so they often have pretty poor exposure. You'll be pretty hard pressed to find good wiki tutorials through like a Google search engine. You might find them linked to you though from other parts that are easier to find in the search engine. And then video sites like YouTube. Irony, again, because videos are a poor way to learn code, and here we are on YouTube, learning how to document code from a video. And then all of you and the rest of your peers are also on YouTube, or not on YouTube, worse, on Zoom, learning how to code. So I do realize the irony, but you probably know firsthand it's not the best way to learn it. And the last thing I want to say about tutorials is that there is a real trend in computer science and software development in general to make everything more user-friendly, the maximum amount of user-friendly. And what they really mean oftentimes when they say that they want something to be user-friendly is they want it to be no tutorial needed. They want grandma to be able to pick it up and run with it, right? They want anybody to be able to just run with it. And that's great for the first 10 minutes that the product is used for. And then it's annoying for the rest of the product's life. And this is a really irritating trend. Not everything has to be hyper user-friendly. You look at, for example, Office before 2007, when most of you were like 5. It used to be an ugly, horrible, disgusting piece of software that looked exactly like my LibreOffice does now, pretty much. It had a bunch of these drop-downs, and each of the drop-down has a bunch of sub-drop-downs. And those have sub-drop-downs sometimes, too. Yes. Drop-downs all the way. And then there's some more, and there's some more. And that is really difficult for a beginner to navigate, right? So what did Office replace all of those drop-downs with? What did they decide to do in order to make it so that you didn't need a tutorial to use Microsoft Office? Well, they adopted the ribbon. The piece of crap ribbon at the top. If you've used Office in the last 10 years or so, you've become familiar with the ribbon. All of the wonderful clickable things up there, and it's just impossible to find anything. Luckily, I think the software world responded to Microsoft dropping the ball on this pretty hard, because Google has essentially supplanted them as the Office suite of choice in most places. Just because Docs goes back to essentially this, a bunch of drop-downs. And the way that Docs abstracted away a lot of that complexity is just either not offering those features or having them hidden in some drop-down somewhere. So not everything has to be super user-friendly to the point that people can use it in the first 10 minutes without a tutorial. Sometimes it's good for people to have a tutorial. It's good for people to need a tutorial. Even though it creates a little bit of a barrier to adoption, it makes your software useful, and it makes it pleasing to use in day-to-day. I mentioned iOS here as another annoying example. So iOS insists on having one button on your iPhone. You get one button. It's the home button. And unfortunately, Android went the same way in its more recent generations. One button. Now, before gesture navigation, so gesture navigation solves a lot of this issue. You have to navigate everything on your iPhone with one button, and then a system back button that wasn't always necessarily in the same place and didn't always necessarily behave in the same way. So iPhone was just, although very easy to pick up, you always know, oh, I'm just going to go find the back button. Very frustrating compared to the approach that has a dedicated hardware back button, which requires the most tiny and marginal increase in learning, but was significantly easier to use after that. Okay, so that's all I got on tutorials. But before we finish for the day, let's check out what I believe is a good one, and that is Unity's. So Unity has a whole page on their website called Unity Learn. Actually, before I look at this, let me just answer that minimum example of why do we use string args. So what is that for? What does it do? So if you wanted to pass instructions to your program from the command line, they would come in there. That's probably the simplest way I can explain it. So I would say, look at something like, I'm assuming the user is familiar with command line in this case. I would say, look at something like ipconfig as an option for -all. -all is an argument for ipconfig, which is the code being executed. Okay, if they're a Linux person, I would say look at something like ls-l as an argument for ls. So those arguments come in that string args array. That's about as minimum as I could do it, probably. All right. So Unity Learn. Let's click one. So just in chat, pick one of the ones you see here, and I'll click it at random, just so you know I'm not rigging it. I'll click one at random, and we'll evaluate it a little. First of all, bite-sized lessons, right? They even emphasize that they are short. Something that you can finish in one session, an afternoon, whatever. Great. Achieve your goals. You're supposed to be learning. Learn by doing from start to finish. Learn by doing again. That's what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be making something. Learning as you make it. That's a good tutorial. Okay, solve real problems. Again, learning by doing. Roll the ball. Roll the ball. Roll the ball is like Unity's oldest tutorial. Where's roll the ball? Is it on here? Roll the ball was pretty crap when I first encountered it in Unity, like 2015 or something. I think they've improved it quite a bit since then. Do that custom render one from the bite size section. Oh man, custom render passes with ERP, Universal Render Pipeline. That's going to be a tough one. It's probably going to be a bad example because this is a complicated subject. So, no tests, right? Because tutorial. But what's nice that Unity does here is it lets you kind of test yourself using your conscience as the gauge of whether or not you've moved on or not. Obviously, I can just click this, right? I don't give a crap, right? I'm going to click these all. Look, I finished it. I'm going to finish this tutorial. But I'm not cheating anyone except myself if I do that. So it's kind of cool to add this sort of game, sort of test feature to it. Voluntary quizzes at the ends of sections are not bad for tutorials too. That kind of thing can actually be really helpful. Give people the ability to verify, even if it's just to themselves, like this button, that they're able to do what you said. So it's a pretty long intro. I'm gonna read it. The Universal Render Pipeline is a subset of Unity's new scriptable render pipeline, first introduced in 2019.3. So this is important info. It seems kind of superfluous, but this is exactly the kind of stuff that I think you must include, and you really should include at the top, just like they've done here. Is what version did this start in? Because if I load 2019.1 or 2018.1 and I don't have this, and I'm going through this tutorial and I'm not figuring out why it's not working, then to me it just looks like a broken tutorial. It's just terrible. So in this case, they say right up front, you've got to have this version or this tutorial is not for you. Okay, so that is an important way to start. This is the version that you need to have, and it's not for you. Now, they could have phrased this without including the history, but if you have an older version, this helps you as well because it lets you know that you have to look for the scriptable render pipeline for something before 2019.3. It replaces the lightweight render pipeline from Unity 2018.3. So now I know that if I don't have 2019.3, I got to go back and look at the lightweight render pipeline, whatever that is, right? Like lightweight render pipeline, the ERP enables developers to extend Unity's graphics pipeline with customized effects using custom render passes, so telling you what you're going to learn how to do here. Unlike ordinary shaders and effects, these passes are camera independent and can persist throughout the entire project without the need to set it up in each scene, again telling us what we're going to be able to do here if we follow through this. Note, like the LERP, the ERP is not compatible with Unity's standard renderer or HERDERP, which is also very useful because if you are new to Unity, you would not know this. And when you first make a project, it asks you what you want to do. Do you want to do ERP, standard, or HERDERP? And if you pick one, you cannot change your mind later. So it's a good note, a good disclaimer to have here because a beginner could definitely very easily make that mistake. In fact, I feel like it should probably mention that fact. Hopefully it does a little later on. In this tutorial, we will be creating a toon outline on our characters and the environment in our scene as illustrated in the image below. A good use of images here. They're showing you what you are going to make. So this is obviously an action shot. They're showing you the software in action when it's done, and they're showing you what it's going to look like when it is finished. This tutorial relies on a couple custom shaders and materials to create the effect. They can be downloaded and placed into your project's assets directory via the University pipeline example. So I got to go here, and this is the part where they lost me, okay? This sucks. How? It says download and place them in your project's assets directory via here, and then there's a link, and it's like, okay, I've never used GitHub before. What do I do? This one says go to file. Let's do that one. Yeah, that was the wrong one. Let's see. Actions. I bet I can download it here. Nope. Well, I give up. That's it. I'm done. Right? That's typically the path that a beginner is going to follow if you've never used GitHub before, which is not an assumption that you can really make in this kind of tutorial. I should really tell you how to download it and put it in the project's assets directory. So it looks like they do that later. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt here and see. So to begin, we first have to set up our project to use ERP, import ERP, window, package manager, search for ERP. Great. With our package installed, let's create a new ERP asset. Seems pretty straightforward. Right click on it, blah, blah, blah. Tell our project to use the asset renderer we created, blah, blah, blah. Very specific, very idiot-proof instructions here. They're telling you which menu to go to, then which submenu, then which submenu again. This is very useful. They've got a very helpful screenshot here of the settings window and exactly what box you need to check. When you have an environment like this, Unity is an environment with lots of checkboxes and lots of buttons. In this case, the action shot is really helpful because you want to guide people to exactly what it looks like. It also shows what version they're using, again, so that you know if your version is different and it's not working for you, that's the reason why, probably. So now you know that this tutorial is built for that version, that date, September 2019. And now I know it's pretty old, so maybe I should go find a newer one. I don't know. I'll see after I download it. If mine's not 7.1.2, then I guess I need to go find a different one. Or maybe I'll just go through this tutorial and see if it works. Okay, another nice disclaimer here. You may notice that the step doesn't affect your project. This is because the forward renderer has not made any changes to the scene. We'll change that in just a bit. So an update telling the person, look, what you've done so far, you're not going to see it yet. We're about to make it go live. And then this looks like a action shot before the toon effect is applied. So this shows you what yours should look like after you followed all of the steps. So again, we're updating the user at the end of every step, showing them what it should look like. Introducing the toon outline and the shader material. So the toon outline shader you imported at the beginning. Ooh, okay, so they just assumed that I was able to do that correctly. Bold of them to assume that I was able to do that correctly. Can be found in Assets Shader and the material found in Assets Material. The shader works by inverting the normals of a mesh, an operation that subsequently makes it no longer affected by lights, extruding them beyond the mesh by some offset, then colorizing them by a user-defined RGB color. Huh? What's a mesh? What's extrusion? What is an offset? Too much info. So that's not beginner-friendly right there. That's something for a more advanced user. Now, I'll grant them that it's a small section, and it might be of benefit to some people who are interested, but this kind of thing should be omitted because it's not relevant to the discussion at hand here. I don't care how the shader works at this point. If I'm learning to make my own shader, which I might in a later tutorial, then I might care how shaders work. But at this point, I'm trying to figure out how to implement a simple custom shader in the universal render pipeline. I don't care how shaders are made. Okay, so that was superfluous. When applied to objects on a layer mask, these extruded normals will appear as outlines around the game objects within that mask. This is kind of a complicated way of phrasing what they mean, which is just that those meshes will have an outline. You could probably assume that the user knows what a mesh is if they're using Unity, but they're going to have an outline. Layer masks and post-processing with renderer passes. Unity renders a scene in multiple passes or steps. Each step produces a single image, for example. One for albedo, ambient occlusion, and normals. Do I need to know that? Probably not. Again, probably superfluous to this example. These images are then composited to craft the final image on the screen. Separating each draw call into multiple passes offers more control over the final look of an image. The toon outline effect is a post-processing effect, meaning it will be rendered on top of the entire screen once the scene has been drawn. So that information was somewhat helpful. The fact that the effects that you create, these custom effects, or this one in particular maybe, actually it's not clear, are post-processing effects that they happen after everything else is drawn. That's semi-helpful, but is it information that I need to know here? Probably not. So this tutorial goes the way that many do, where it starts out beginner-friendly and then quickly dives into too much depth on stuff that's not necessarily relevant to the topic at hand. We can assign game objects to different layers to explicitly define which objects will be affected by this post-processing effect, effectively creating a mask. So what's mask? I don't know. Okay, so that's bad because we said effectively creating a mask, but we didn't really explain what that was. And it shows me how to add things to different layers. Then it tells me how to create a layer mask. So it mentions mask again, but now I really don't know what it is. To extend our custom forward renderer with a new render pass, click it and navigate to the inspector. I don't know what a render pass is, so that's not helpful either. Click the plus and select render objects. So this has turned into essentially a guide at this point. It's telling me what to do and just giving me the steps to do it. It's not really much of a tutorial at this point because this knowledge really isn't generalizable beyond this very specific implementation here. At this point, I'm probably just following along with the steps, and I'm not really learning anything. Now, if all I wanted to do was to get a toon outline working, that'd be fine. But this has devolved more into guide form. It's a good guide in the sense that it has pictures and the steps are easy to follow. It's a bad guide in the sense that it has a lot of extra text that we don't necessarily need in order to just complete this guide. Next, we'll create a material override to define how we want to render objects on the character layer. So again, it's pretty complicated. With this render pass set up, the game objects in your scene, in this instance the characters and the background props, should render with a thin toon outline. Cool. So now I see what's going on after I do that. Conclusion: through the use of layer masks, we can define how to render a specific set of objects using custom render passes in the ERP. We also have the option of using shader graph to power the materials used in each render pass instead of relying on traditional AHL. So wait a second, shader graph? That wasn't mentioned anywhere in the other stuff above, was it? Or at least I didn't see it. And I followed along pretty carefully there. I certainly don't know what a shader graph is or how it works. So this tutorial, not perfect, but pretty good. So there's a lot of good you can take away here. The fact that they have it at all is a huge win in Unity's camp because other platforms just don't. So even though it's not perfect, and even though it has a lot of extra information, better to have extra than not enough. And better to have something than nothing at all. So if you want some good examples of Unity tutorial, good examples of tutorials in general, I'd say check out Unity Learn and look at some of the ones they have, because they do have quite a few good ones. And even though that one wasn't perfect, I would still say it was pretty good. It showed me what I needed to do, and I know a little bit more about how to use ERP than I did when I started. Alright, so that's it for today. Since, I still have another homework due, I'm not going to assign another for a bit. Probably won't do a tutorial homework until much later, so you guys can do one for your senior design project. But enjoy the break, and I'll see you in senior design.